A salesperson has just finished a pitch. 2 minutes ago you were not convinced. Now you are reaching for your card. Nothing about the actual offer changed in those 2 minutes. 6 things changed in the room instead, and not one of them had anything to do with the merits of what you were buying. That is the strange part worth sitting with before we go any further. You like to think of yourself as a reasoning creature who gathers evidence and then decides, and most of the time you are, or close enough that the difference does not matter. But there is a narrow, recurring set of situations even ordinary favors between neighbors, where something else takes over first. This is not a trick that only works on careless or gullible people. It is a shortcut that works on careful, skeptical people too, because it is not aimed at your judgment at all. It is aimed at what happens a half second before your judgment gets a vote. This is worth taking seriously precisely because it is not about intelligence or willpower. A brilliant negotiator and a distracted shopper are both running the same underlying hardware, and both can be routed around in the same way, through the same half-dozen doors. Knowing that the doors exist will not seal them shut. But it changes what you notice, and noticing is the only part of this that is actually under your control. Robert Cialdini spent a career finding out exactly what that something else is. He holds the title of Regents Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Marketing at Arizona State University, and he earned his doctorate in social psychology from the University of North Carolina in 1970. What makes his research unusual is the method he chose. Rather than study stretches training and working inside the organizations that were best at getting people to say yes, sales floors, fundraising operations, advertising agencies, so that he could watch the technique operate in its natural habitat before he ever tried to explain it. What came out of that research was a 1984 book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, and inside it a claim that has held up across for decades of testing since. Nearly all of that yes-getting power collapses down to 6 triggers. Reciprocity. Social proof. Authority. Liking. Scarcity. Commitment and consistency. Here is the part that turns this from a list into a mechanism. Cialdini's argument was never that these 6 things are clever rhetorical flourishes that a smooth talker happens to deploy on you. His argument was that each one is a shortcut your brain built for good reasons, a rule of thumb that is right often enough to be worth having permanently installed so that you are not stuck re-deriving every decision from scratch under time pressure. Something is scarce, therefore it is probably valuable, most of the time. Everyone else seems to be doing it, therefore it is probably safe or correct, most of the time. A legitimate authority said so, therefore it is probably true, most of the time. None of that is a stupid heuristic. It is a compressed judgment, built from a long history of it usually being right. The problem is that the trigger and the reason behind it can be pulled apart from one another, and once they are separated, a persuader can hand you the trigger directly without the underlying reason ever being true. That is what these 6 mechanisms really are underneath the label of persuasion. Exposed wiring. Let us look at each one, and at the specific study that first pinned it down with numbers. The first trigger is reciprocity, the felt obligation to return a favor to whoever gave it, and its cleanest demonstration involves a soft drink. The idea has deep roots in how sociologists describe fairness itself. Once one person does something of value for another, the relationship briefly tips out of balance, the giver's costs went up while the receiver's rewards went up, and the receiver can restore that balance only by giving something back. Regan set out to test whether this norm of reciprocity, as it is sometimes called, could really drive a stranger's later behavior, and whether it needed liking to do it. In 1971, Dennis Regan, then a doctoral candidate whose research was conducted at Stanford, ran an experiment disguised as a study of aesthetics. 81 male students arrived believing they would be rating paintings, working in an adjoining room alongside another participant who was actually a Confederate. Partway through the session, that Confederate left the room on a short errand and returned holding 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. In one condition, he handed one to the subject, explaining that decided to buy one for the subject too. In a second condition, it was the experimenter, not the Confederate, who brought the drinks, so that any subject who received a Coke at all did not receive it specifically from the person who would later make a request. In a third condition, nobody received anything. Later in that same session, the Confederate asked every subject for something entirely unrelated to the soft drink. Would they buy raffle tickets, 25 cents each, to help his high school back home build a new gym, with a car as the prize? 1.73 tickets. The subjects who had received a Coke from the experimenter instead bought 1.08. The subjects who received nothing bought 0.92. Looked at differently, 58% of the people who got a Coke from the Confederate went on to buy more than a single ticket, compared with only 25% among the two groups who had either received nothing or received their drink from someone other than the person asking. A 25-cent favor, entirely disconnected from the request that followed it minutes later, close to doubled how much people were willing to spend on a stranger's raffle. Here is the detail that turns this into a real mechanism study rather than a pleasant anecdote. Reagan also manipulated how likable the Confederate seemed, having him handle a phone call either politely or rudely before the favor was ever introduced. People did like the polite version of him more, and people who had received a favor from him rated him afterward as more generous and more likable than people who had not. But when Reagan checked whether that increased liking was actually what drove the extra raffle tickets, the numbers refused to cooperate with that explanation. Compliance were significantly correlated, meaning the more you liked him, the more you gave him. Among the subjects who did receive the favor, that correlation nearly disappeared. The favor did not buy compliance by making the Confederate more likable in the moment. It bought compliance by creating an obligation, a felt debt, that operated whether or not warmth was present at all. That is reciprocity functioning as a trigger rather than as a sentiment. The debt fires on its own terms, which is exactly why a complete stranger can manufacture it later. The second trigger is social proof, the assumption that if enough other people like you are doing something, it is probably the reasonable thing to do. The clearest modern demonstration of it did not happen in a laboratory at all but in hotel bathrooms. In 2008, Noah Goldstein, Robert Cialdini, and Vladas Griskovičius published a field experiment in the Journal of Consumer Research testing two different ways of asking hotel guests to reuse their towels instead of having housekeeping wash them daily. One card made the standard of helps protect the environment, please consider doing your part. A second card said nothing about the environment at all. It simply reported what other guests had already done in that same program, describing the level of participation among previous occupants of the room. The card that described what other guests were already doing produced meaningfully higher reuse than the traditional environmental appeal, with participation climbing from roughly 35% under the standard message to roughly 44% under the social proof message. Nothing about the actual environmental stakes changed between the two cards sitting on the identical bathroom counter. The only variable that changed was whether guests were told what people in their same situation had already chosen to do. The researchers then pushed the finding one step further, and this is the detail that elevates it from a nice result to an actual mechanism. It is not simply that people follow a crowd. It is that people follow the crowd that feels most specifically relevant to them, in this exact place, right now. A follow-up version of the sign, telling guests that the majority of guests who had stayed specifically in this room had reused version referencing hotel guests in general. The closer and more particular the comparison group, the stronger the pull toward matching it. Social proof, in other words, is not a vague appeal to popularity in the abstract. It is a targeted comparison to people just like you, standing exactly where you are standing, and the tighter that resemblance, the less your own independent judgment gets consulted before you fall in line with it. The third trigger is authority, and here the demonstration is the most famous and the most unsettling experiment social psychology has ever produced. In 1963, Stanley Milgram, at Yale, recruited 40 men between the ages of 20 and 50 from the New Haven area, ordinary residents with no university affiliation, paid a small fee simply for showing up regardless of what happened afterward. Each was told he would serve as teacher in a study of punishment and memory, reading word pairs to a learner seated in an adjoining room and delivering an electric shock every time the learner answered incorrectly. The shock generator in front of him carried 30 switches in a row, rising in 15-volt increments from 15 volts all the way to 400. Strong, very strong, and intense, up to a final label reading danger, severe shock, with the last two switches marked only with 3XS. The learner was, in truth, a Confederate who was never actually shocked, but the subject did not know that, and was given one genuine mild shock himself at the outset so the setup would feel authentic. As the learner's answers grew steadily worse and the shocks climbed accordingly, the learner protested audibly through the wall, eventually pounding on it, and then, past a certain voltage, fell completely and permanently or turn to the experimenter for guidance. The experimenter, a composed man in a grey technician's coat, delivered one of 4 scripted prods in fixed sequence, moving from a simple "please continue" up to "you have no other choice, you must go on." Before running a single subject, Milgram had asked 14 Yale psychology seniors to predict how 100 ordinary people would behave in this exact situation. Their estimates ranged from 0 to 3%, going all the way to the maximum shock, with a class average of 1.2%. Trained psychologists in training think would continue once the shocks clearly became painful. They were wrong by an enormous margin. 26 of the 40 subjects, 65%, continued issuing shocks all the way to the maximum 450 volts, the point at which the experimenter himself finally called a halt to the session. This was not calm, indifferent compliance. Many of the obedient subjects showed visible signs of extreme distress while continuing to obey. 14 of the 40 displayed what Milgram described as nervous laughter, and 3 seizures, one severe enough that the session had to be stopped entirely to let the subject recover. When asked afterward to rate, on a 14-point scale, how painful the final shocks had felt to the learner, the single most common answer was the maximum, extremely painful, with an average rating of 13.42 out of 14. These were people who believed, correctly by their own account, that they were causing serious suffering, said so once it was over, and kept going anyway, because a calm man in a lab coat, representing an institution of unimpeachable reputation, told them that writing up the original results, pointed to something specific about the setting that he believed made this obedience possible, and it lines up exactly with the authority trigger. The experiment was sponsored by and took place on the grounds of what he called an institution of unimpeachable reputation, Yale University, and he argued that subjects could reasonably presume the personnel running it were competent and legitimate. He later ran a variation in a plain office suite in Bridgeport, Connecticut, presented as an ordinary commercial testing firm with no visible tie to the university, and obedience to the maximum shock in that setting is commonly reported at around 47.5%, down from 62.5% in the matched Yale condition. The intuitive story is that stripping away institutional prestige stripped away a large share of the obedience with it. The honest complication is that this specific comparison has not held up as cleanly as the popular retelling suggests. A statistical synthesis pooling obedience rates across Milgram's full set of variations found that the low-status Bridgeport setting was not, on its own, significantly associated with lower obedience once other differences between the conditions were accounted for. Authority is very likely still doing real work in that data. It is just doing it in a messier, more entangled way than a single dramatic before and after comparison implies, and it is worth resisting the tidier version of the story for exactly that reason. It would be easy to file the core finding away as a relic of a more obedient decade, so it is worth being honest about what happened when someone checked more recently. In 2009, Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University ran a modified, ethically constrained version of the same design, stopping the procedure at a much lower shock level than Milgram's original for the safety of participants and comparing obedience rates only up to that same shared point. The result was not comfortable. 70% of Berger's subjects had to be stopped as they continued past that threshold, compared with 82.5% of Milgram's original subjects who had continued past the identical point back in 1963, a gap the researchers found was not statistically significant. Whatever authority is doing to behavior in that room, it does not appear to have expired with the decade that discovered it. The fourth trigger is liking, and while much of it runs through channels you would expect, physical attractiveness, similarity, plain familiarity, Cialdini's own research uncovered a subtler version of it. We do not only comply more with people we already like, we actively work to associate ourselves with success in order to be liked and respected more ourselves. In 1976, Cialdini and 5 colleagues published a set of 3 field studies on a tendency they named basking in reflected glory, shortened to bruging. In the first study, they covertly monitored what students wore to class at 7 universities with major college football programs across an entire season, tracking how often students showed up wearing apparel that identified their own school. The pattern held consistently across schools. Students wore school-branded clothing significantly more often the Monday after their team had won than the Monday after a loss or a tie, even though nothing about the previous weekend score had any bearing on which clothes were already sitting in their closets. The researchers then tested whether this was really about status rather than simple mood, by seeing how students at a different university described a football result over the phone to a stranger conducting what they believed was an unrelated campus survey. describing a win, and a more distant they, or a plain recitation of the score, when describing a loss, using we to describe a victory nearly twice as often as they used it to describe a non-victory, 26% versus 13.5%. Not one subject in the study had thrown a single pass or blocked a single tackle. The team's success became a resource for personal image anyway, and a third study found the pull toward claiming it was strongest precisely when a subject's own reputation had just taken a hit from an unrelated failure. The researchers explained the observers who see a positive connection between a person and a successful source will tend to evaluate that person more favorably too, simply to keep their own impressions internally consistent. If proclaiming the connection can make an observer see you in a better light, then proclaiming it becomes worth doing even when you had nothing to do with the success itself. People do not only like people who are successful. People work to be seen standing next to success, and a persuader who can attach themselves, or a product, to something admired borrows some of that same reflected shine without earning any of it directly. The fifth trigger is scarcity, the sense that anything hard to get automatically becomes worth more simply because it is hard to get. In 1975, Stephen Wurtzel, Jerry Lee, and Akam Adewale ran a deceptively simple experiment built around a jar of cookies. Participants were asked to rate identical cookies presented to them either in generous supply or in short supply. When the cookies were scarce, they were consistently rated as more desirable and more valuable than the exact same cookies presented in abundance, even though nothing about the cookies themselves, their taste, their freshness, their appearance, had changed in the slightest. The more revealing result came from a second version of the same setup. Some participants saw a jar that had been scarce the entire time. Others saw a jar that started out full and then, while they watched, was visibly reduced down to only a couple of cookies. The cookies that had gone from abundant to scarce in front of the participants' eyes were rated as more valuable than cookies that had simply been scarce from the very beginning. Watching supply shrink mattered more to perceived value than never having had much supply at all. This is the mechanism sitting stock notice you have ever scrolled past. It is not really telling you the product is good. It is telling you that the opportunity to have it is closing, and a closing opportunity recruits a kind of urgency that an abundant one never manages to produce. The trigger is not really about the object at all. It is about the freedom to choose it later, and the felt loss of that freedom does work on you that a straightforward pitch about quality never quite manages. The sixth and final trigger is commitment and consistency, the pull toward behaving in a way that matches something you have already said. A total stranger. One of the most vivid demonstrations of it took place not in a laboratory but on a public beach. In 1975, Thomas Moriarty staged a theft on a beach in New York. A Confederate would spread a blanket near an unsuspecting sunbather, turn on a portable radio, and after a couple of minutes get up and either ask the bystander a small, unrelated favor, for a light, or ask something far more specific, would you watch my things while I step away for a minute? Shortly afterward, a second Confederate walked up in with it. When the bystander had only been asked for a light, almost nobody intervened. For out of 20 bystanders, 20% made any attempt at all to stop the theft, and some later claimed they had not even noticed the radio was gone. When the bystander had explicitly agreed moments earlier to watch the belongings, the outcome flipped almost entirely. 19 out of 20, 95%, physically intervened, some chasing the thief down the sand to get the radio back. Nothing about the actual risk of confronting a stranger. What changed was a 15-second spoken commitment, made out loud to another person, that the bystander then apparently felt bound to honor once it was tested against a real theft. A small verbal promise, extracted before the moment that actually mattered, produced more brave, effortful, personally risky intervention than either general courage or a generic sense of civic duty appeared to manage on their own. 6 mechanisms, 6 separate research programs spanning for different decades, and one recurring shape sitting underneath all of them. None of these triggers is None of them tend to arrive alone in the real world either, and that is worth naming plainly before we close. A single well-built sales page can carry a small free sample near the top, which is reciprocity. A note that thousands of other customers already bought this exact item, which is social proof. An endorsement from a credentialed expert or institution, which is authority. A founder's personal story designed to make you feel connected to them, which is liking. A countdown clock in the corner, which is scarcity. And a tiny early commitment, add to cart, start your free trial, agree to the terms, which is consistency waiting to be called on later. None of these 6 triggers is especially powerful in isolation. Stacked together in the same 5 minutes, they behave less like 6 separate nudges and more like a single coordinated current, and that is precisely why the earlier point about your own careful reasoning still applies here. Skepticism about any one trigger does very little when 5 others are firing at the same time. Each one is a shortcut that ordinarily protects you, letting you act quickly on scarce time and incomplete information without reason. What a skilled persuader does is not lie to your reasoning directly. It is arrange the room so that the shortcut fires before your reasoning is ever consulted at all, offering a small favor before the real ask arrives, showing you what people just like you have supposedly already chosen, borrowing a title or a uniform, letting something look like it is about to run out, or extracting a small spoken yes long before the request that yes will later be used to justify. It is worth being plain about what this is and what it is not. This is a description of how influence operates, verified in laboratories, in hotel corridors, and on a public beach, not a set of instructions for exploiting the people around you, and using it that way corrodes the very trust that makes reciprocity, liking, and commitment worth anything in a relationship that has to survive longer than a single transaction. It is also worth being honest that simply knowing about a shortcut does not fully immunize you against it in the moment it fires. Understanding a mechanism intellectually is not the same thing as feeling immune to it in the room where it is actually deployed, because these triggers do not operate through the part of you that reads or watches explanations of triggers. The most reliable defense these 6 studies point toward is not vigilance in general, which is exhausting and impossible to sustain, but noticing one specific pattern, a small commitment, a small favor, or a claim about what everyone else is doing that arrives suspiciously close in time to an actual request. That proximity is rarely a coincidence, and it is far easier to spot than the trigger itself is to resist once it has already fired. Here is what is worth sitting with after all 6. Somewhere this week, you will be the target of at least one of these triggers, almost certainly without any label attached to it. Which one tends to actually work on you? Not the one you find most interesting to talk about, but the one that has genuinely gotten your money, your time, or your agreement before you fully noticed what had happened. Tell me in the comments, because most people can immediately name the trigger that gets everyone else and go strangely quiet about the one that gets them. In the next video, we leave the psychology of saying yes to someone else and turn to a harder, quieter problem, why it is so difficult to give your full attention to your own work, even in a room where nobody is trying to persuade you of anything at all. That is the subject of deep work,